Bullies try to jump the student after school. Big mistake. He was trained and beat them up. Marcus Rodriguez pulled his red hoodie tighter around his shoulders as he walked through the front doors of Westfield High School for the third time that week. The fabric was soft and worn, a comfort item he'd carried through 3 different schools in 2 years. His family moved frequently due to his father's construction work, and Marcus had learned that keeping a low profile was usually the best strategy for surviving in a new place. At 17, he was neither tall nor particularly broad, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and quiet brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. The hallways of Westfield buzzed with the typical morning energy of teenagers rushing to lockers and catching up on gossip. Marcus navigated through the crowd with practiced invisibility, keeping his head down and his backpack clutched tight. He'd already mapped out the school's layout during his first 2 days, identifying the quickest routes between classes and the corners where he could eat lunch alone without drawing attention. "Hey, look what we got here," a voice called out from behind him as he approached his locker. Marcus didn't need to turn around to know he was the target. He'd heard that particular tone before at Jefferson High and Roosevelt Prep. It was the sound of trouble finding him once again. The voice belonged to Tyler Brennan, a stocky senior with bleached hair and the kind of swagger that came from never having faced real consequences. Tyler was flanked by his usual crew, Jake Morrison, tall and lanky, with a cruel smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face, and Danny Walsh, shorter but built like a linebacker, with knuckles that looked like they'd seen plenty of use. They were the unofficial kings of Westfield's social hierarchy, the type who mistook fear for respect and used their size and reputation to maintain control over their territory. "New kid thinks he's too good to say hello," Tyler continued, stepping closer until Marcus could smell the energy drink on his breath. "That's not very friendly, is it, guys?" Marcus kept his focus on his locker combination, his fingers steady despite the tension building in his shoulders. He'd been through this dance before. The key was to not give them what they wanted, a reaction, fear, or most importantly, a reason to escalate. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that Marcus had spent the last 4 years training in underground fight clubs across 3 different cities. His father's constant relocations had introduced him to a world where survival meant learning to fight, and Marcus had discovered he had a natural talent for violence that both thrilled and terrified him. "I'm talking to you, red shirt," Tyler said, shoving Marcus's shoulder hard enough to slam him against the metal locker. The sound echoed through the hallway, causing several students to glance over before quickly looking away. Nobody wanted to get involved with Tyler's crew. Marcus straightened slowly, his hand still on his locker door. "Sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just trying to get my books." Jake laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the hallway noise. "Listen to him, guys. Just trying to get my books," he mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "What are you, 12? Danny stepped up on Marcus's other side, effectively boxing him in against the lockers. "We heard you're from Chicago," he said, cracking his knuckles deliberately. "Big city boy, huh? Well, this is a small town, and we run things here. You understand what I'm saying?" Marcus nodded, keeping his eyes down. Inside his chest, he could feel his heart rate slowing, his breathing becoming more controlled. These were the physical responses he'd trained for years to cultivate before a fight, but he pushed them down. Fighting here would mean questions, investigations, and possibly criminal charges. More importantly, it would mean his father finding out about the underground circuit, something Marcus had kept hidden for 2 years. "Good," Tyler said, patting Marcus's cheek in a gesture that was meant to be humiliating. "Now here's how things work. Every day, you're going to give us whatever cash you've got on you. Think of it as a friendship tax. And on Fridays, you're going to do our homework for us. Math, English, whatever we need. Got it?" Before Marcus could respond, the warning bell rang, and the hallway began to empty as students rushed to their first period classes. Tyler's crew backed off, but the message was clear. This was just the beginning. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions and forced participation in classes where Marcus tried to blend into the background. During lunch, he found a quiet table in the corner of the cafeteria, pulling out a sandwich his mother had packed and a worn paperback novel. He'd learned that having something to read made him look busy and less approachable, though it rarely worked for long. "Well, well, well," Jake's voice cut through his concentration. "If it isn't our new best friend." Marcus looked up to see all three of them approaching his table, carrying lunch trays and wearing identical grins that promised trouble. The cafeteria was full of students, but Marcus could already see them turning away, pretending not to notice what was about to happen. "Mind if we sit?" Tyler asked, not waiting for an answer, before sliding into the seat across from Marcus. Jake and Danny flanked him on either side, their presence immediately making the small table feel cramped and threatening. "Actually," Marcus started, beginning to stand up. "Sit down," Danny said sharply, his hand landing heavy on Marcus's shoulder and forcing him back into his chair. "We're not done talking." Tyler reached across the table and picked up Marcus's sandwich, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Turkey and Swiss," he announced to his friends. "Not bad. I was getting tired of the cafeteria food anyway." He took a large bite, chewing slowly while maintaining eye contact with Marcus. Crumbs fell onto the table between them, and Tyler made no effort to clean them up. It was a deliberate show of disrespect, designed to establish dominance in the most basic way possible. "You know what I think," Jake said, leaning back in his chair. "I think our friend here needs to understand his place in the food chain. This isn't Chicago, kid. You can't just come into our school and expect to be treated like you belong." Marcus felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. In the underground circuit, he'd learned to read opponents, to understand their motivations and weaknesses. Tyler was the classic alpha bully, needing constant validation of his power. Jake was the instigator, the one who pushed situations toward violence. Danny was the enforcer, the muscle who did the actual dirty work. They operated as a pack, feeding off each other's energy and confidence. "Look," Marcus said carefully, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to get through school." "Trouble?" Tyler laughed, finishing Marcus's sandwich and wiping his hands on Marcus's napkin. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly. Right, guys?" He nodded to Danny, who immediately reached over and knocked Marcus's book to the floor. The paperback hit the ground and slid under the next table, pages splaying open. "Oops," Danny said with mock sincerity. "Clumsy me." Marcus started to get up to retrieve his book, but Jake's foot shot out, blocking his path. "Where you going, red shirt?" "Lunch isn't over yet." The nickname stung more than Marcus wanted to admit. Throughout his time in the underground circuit, he'd earned respect through his fighting ability. Promoters knew his name, opponents feared him, and spectators cheered when he entered the makeshift rings. But here, he was just red shirt, a nobody who could be pushed around without consequences. "Please," Marcus said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Just let me get my book." Tyler leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Say, 'Please, sir,'" he demanded. "Show some respect." The cafeteria seemed to grow quieter around them, other students sensing the tension but unwilling to intervene. Marcus could see a few teachers at the far end of the room, but they were deep in conversation and paying no attention to the drama unfolding at his table. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself the way his trainer had taught him. In the underground circuit, there were rules, codes of conduct that even the most brutal fighters respected. What was happening here was different. It was systematic humiliation designed to break down his sense of self-worth. It was the kind of psychological warfare that could destroy someone who didn't have the tools to fight back. But Marcus did have those tools. He just couldn't use them. "Please, sir," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, Let me get my book. Tyler's grin widened. That's better. See, guys? He can learn. He nodded to Jake, who moved his foot. Marcus quickly retrieved his book, checking the pages for damage as he returned to his seat. The spine was bent, but it was still readable. Same time tomorrow, Red Shirt, Tyler said as the three of them stood up. And don't forget about our little arrangement. We'll be expecting that friendship tax. They walked away laughing, leaving Marcus alone at the table with the remains of his lunch scattered around him. He sat there for several minutes, staring at the crumbs Tyler had left behind, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes that had watched him be humiliated without stepping in to help. The afternoon classes dragged by with Marcus, unable to focus on anything but the encounter in the cafeteria. He'd dealt with bullies before, but never with such a systematic approach. Tyler's crew wasn't just looking for a quick power trip. They were establishing a long-term arrangement that would keep Marcus under their control for the remainder of the school year. As the final bell rang, Marcus gathered his books and headed for his locker, hoping to avoid another confrontation. But as he turned the corner into the main hallway, he saw them waiting for him. Tyler was leaning against the lockers with his arms crossed, while Jake and Danny flanked the exit doors. They'd positioned themselves perfectly to catch him no matter which way he tried to leave. "Time to pay up, Red Shirt," Tyler called out as Marcus approached. The hallway was emptying quickly as students rushed to catch buses or head to after-school activities, leaving Marcus with fewer potential witnesses. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, his lunch money for the next day. He held it out without making eye contact, hoping the transaction would be quick and quiet. Tyler snatched the money and examined it with theatrical disappointment. $5? That's it? Come on, Chicago. I know you've got more than this. That's all I have, Marcus said truthfully. His family wasn't wealthy, and he'd learned to make every dollar stretch. Check his backpack, Jake suggested with a cruel smile. Maybe he's hiding something. Before Marcus could protest, Danny grabbed his backpack and dumped the contents onto the floor. Books, notebooks, pens, and personal items scattered across the hallway tile. Other students walking by stepped around the mess without stopping, their eyes carefully averted. "Look what we have here," Tyler said, picking up a small photo that had fallen from one of Marcus's textbooks. It showed Marcus with his arms around a middle-aged man and woman, clearly his parents, taken at what looked like a family barbecue. "Aw, how sweet. He carries pictures of Mommy and Daddy." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as Tyler held the photo up for Jake and Danny to see. "My parents," he said quietly, reaching out his hand. "Please give it back." "Please," Tyler mocked, holding the photo higher. "I think we need to teach our friends some manners about asking nicely." He made a show of examining the photo more closely, then looked back at Marcus with a calculating expression. "You know what? I think I'll hang on to this for a while. Maybe show it around, let everyone know what a mama's boy we've got here." "Give it back," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning that made Jake and Danny exchange glances. For just a moment, something had shifted in Marcus's demeanor, a subtle change in posture, a different quality to his stillness. Tyler either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. "Or what?" he challenged, waving the photo tauntingly. "You going to tell the teacher? Call your mommy to come pick you up?" Marcus took a step forward, and suddenly the air in the hallway felt different. Danny's hand moved instinctively toward his waistband, and Jake straightened up from his casual lean against the wall. Something about Marcus's movement had triggered their predator instincts, warning them that the prey might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. But Tyler was too invested in the performance to back down now. With a deliberate motion, he tore the photo in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor around Marcus's scattered belongings. "Oops," Tyler said with exaggerated innocence. "Looks like there was an accident." Marcus stared down at the torn pieces of the photo, feeling something break loose inside his chest. The image had been taken last summer, during one of the few times his family had felt stable and happy. His mother had insisted on the picture, saying she wanted to remember the moment when everything felt perfect. When Marcus looked up, Tyler took an involuntary step backward. The quiet, submissive boy from the cafeteria was gone, replaced by someone with dead, calm eyes and the kind of stillness that preceded explosion. "You shouldn't have done that," Marcus said softly. "Yeah." Tyler recovered his bravado quickly, stepping back into Marcus's personal space. "What are you going to do about it, Red Shirt? Cry?" Marcus bent down and began picking up his scattered belongings, his movements careful and deliberate. He gathered the torn pieces of the photograph and tucked them into his pocket, then methodically repacked his backpack. The three bullies watched him with growing confusion, unsure why their victim wasn't reacting the way they expected. "That's right," Jake said, trying to regain the momentum. "Clean up your mess like a good little boy." Marcus stood slowly, shouldering his backpack. When he looked at Tyler again, his expression was completely neutral. "I'll see you after school," he said simply. "What's that supposed to mean?" Danny demanded. But Marcus was already walking away, heading toward the exit doors with steady, measured steps. Tyler called after him, "Hey, we're not done here!" But Marcus didn't turn around or acknowledge the shout. He pushed through the doors and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving the three bullies standing in the hallway with a vague sense that something had just shifted in their carefully controlled dynamic. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly for Marcus. He walked home to the small apartment his family was renting, ate a quiet dinner with his parents, and completed his homework with mechanical precision. His mother asked about his day, and he gave her the standard fine response that teenagers had perfected for generations. She didn't push for details, though he caught her studying his face with the concerned expression parents developed when they sensed their children were struggling. That evening, Marcus stood in front of his bedroom mirror and unwrapped the athletic tape from around his hands, a habit he'd maintained even during his forced retirement from fighting. His knuckles were still scarred from his last bout 3 months ago, faint lines that told the story of a young man who'd learned to survive through violence. The underground circuit had found him by accident during his family's time in Detroit. Marcus had been getting beaten up by local kids near their apartment complex when an older man named Eddie Torino had intervened. Eddie had been a professional boxer in his youth and now served as a scout for underground fighting operations throughout the Midwest. He'd seen something in Marcus's willingness to keep getting up after being knocked down and had offered to teach him how to fight back. What had started as self-defense lessons had evolved into something much more serious. Marcus discovered he had natural timing, devastating power in his hands, and most importantly, the ability to stay calm under pressure. Within 6 months, he was fighting in basements and warehouses for cash prizes that helped his family pay rent. Within a year, he had developed a reputation as one of the most promising young fighters in the circuit. But the underground world came with dangers beyond physical injury. There were criminal elements, gambling debts, and the constant threat of police raids. When his family moved to their current location, Marcus had made the decision to leave that life behind. He'd told himself he could survive high school through the same techniques that had served him in previous schools. Keep quiet, stay invisible, and wait for graduation. Tyler Brennan had made that strategy impossible. Marcus rewrapped his hands and spent an hour working through his training routine, shadow boxing in the small space between his bed and desk. His body remembered the movements perfectly, the footwork, the combinations, the way to generate maximum power from minimal space. Muscle memory was a powerful thing, and despite months of inactivity, Marcus felt his reflexes sharpening with each repetition. The next morning at school, Marcus could sense the change in atmosphere immediately. Word had spread about the confrontation in the hallway, and students were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to be waiting for entertainment, but all of them knew something was building toward a conclusion. Tyler's crew was more aggressive than usual, emboldened by their apparent victory the day before. They made a point of blocking Marcus's path in the hallways, forcing him to walk around them while they made loud comments about his appearance, his family, and his general worthlessness. During lunch, they took over his usual corner table, forcing him to eat standing up near the garbage cans. "Looking a little tense there, red shirt," Jake commented, as Marcus passed their table on his way to throw away his lunch tray. "You sleep okay last night? Maybe you were having nightmares about torn photographs." Marcus didn't respond, but several students at nearby tables had stopped eating to listen. The tension in the cafeteria was becoming palpable, and even some of the teachers were starting to take notice. "I heard his mommy called the school," Danny added loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Wanted to complain about kids being mean to her precious baby." This wasn't true, but truth had never been important to bullies. The lie would spread through the school's gossip network within hours, adding another layer of humiliation to Marcus's growing reputation as a victim. "That's enough," came a voice from across the cafeteria. Everyone turned to see Sarah Martinez, a senior who served as student body president and generally commanded respect from both students and faculty. She was walking toward their table with a determined expression that suggested she'd finally decided to intervene. "Stay out of this, Martinez," Tyler warned, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Sarah had the kind of social status that could make life difficult for bullies if she chose to make an issue of their behavior. "No," Sarah said firmly, stopping directly beside Marcus. "I won't stay out of it. What you're doing is pathetic, and everyone knows it." For a moment, Marcus felt a surge of hope that someone was finally willing to stand up to Tyler's crew, but he also knew that Sarah's intervention would only make things worse in the long run. Bullies didn't respond well to public humiliation, and they would take their frustration out on him once there were no witnesses around. "Thanks," Marcus said quietly to Sarah, "but it's okay. I can handle it." Sarah looked at him with surprise and disappointment. "You don't have to handle it alone," she said. "There are people who will help if you just ask." But Marcus was already walking away, leaving Sarah standing beside Tyler's table with a frustrated expression. He knew she meant well, but she didn't understand the dynamics at play. Tyler's crew wouldn't be deterred by social pressure or administrative intervention. They would only be stopped by someone willing to meet them on their own terms. The final confrontation came that afternoon as Marcus was leaving school. He deliberately stayed late in the library, hoping Tyler's crew would give up waiting and go home. But as he pushed through the front doors of Westfield High, he saw them positioned strategically around the parking lot. Tyler was leaning against a car near the exit, while Jake and Danny had positioned themselves to block the main walkway. Other students were leaving in groups, heading toward buses and cars, with the casual chatter of teenagers whose biggest worry was weekend plans. A few noticed the positioning of Tyler's crew and quickened their pace, instinctively avoiding what looked like a developing situation. Marcus adjusted his backpack straps and started walking toward the street, hoping to circle around the parking lot and avoid the confrontation. But Tyler pushed off from the car and called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, red shirt, we need to talk." Marcus kept walking, but he could hear footsteps behind him as all three bullies fell into step. The parking lot was emptying quickly as students sensed trouble and made themselves scarce. Within minutes, the area around the school entrance was deserted, except for Marcus and his pursuers. "I said we need to talk," Tyler repeated, his voice carrying the edge that suggested the talking phase was almost over. Marcus reached the sidewalk and turned to face them. The three bullies had spread out in a semicircle, cutting off his escape routes and positioning themselves for maximum intimidation. They looked confident, relaxed even, like predators who had cornered their prey. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "What do I want?" Tyler laughed, but there was no humor in it. I want you to understand something, Chicago. Yesterday you disrespected me in front of half the school. You walked away when I was talking to you and you made me look weak. I didn't disrespect anyone, Marcus said calmly. I just picked up my things and left. See, that's where you're wrong, Jake interjected, cracking his knuckles in preparation. When Tyler's talking to you, you listen until he's done. That's how respect works. Danny stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the cigarette smoke on his clothes. We tried to be nice, he said. We tried to teach you the rules the easy way. But I guess you need a harder lesson. Marcus felt the familiar calm settling over him, the same focused state he'd entered before every fight in the underground circuit. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened, and his awareness expanded to take in every detail of his surroundings. 3 opponents, spread out but not professionally. They were used to intimidating victims, not fighting trained fighters. Tyler was the leader, but probably the weakest physically. Jake was tall but unbalanced, favoring his right side. Danny was the most dangerous, built like a wrestler with calloused knuckles that suggested real fighting experience. Last chance, red shirt, Tyler said, pulling off his jacket and tossing it aside. Get on your knees, apologize for disrespecting me, and maybe we'll just rough you up a little. Keep acting tough, and we'll put you in the hospital. Marcus slowly shrugged off his backpack, setting it down carefully on the sidewalk. The motion was deliberate, methodical, and something about it made Jake take a half step backward. You sure you want to do this? Marcus asked, his voice carrying a new quality that none of them had heard before. It wasn't fear or pleading, it was the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. What's that supposed to mean? Danny demanded, but his eyes were studying Marcus with new attention, picking up on subtle changes in posture and positioning. Marcus straightened up from placing his backpack down, and when he looked at them again, the transformation was complete. The quiet, submissive boy they'd been terrorizing was gone, replaced by someone with the predatory stillness of a trained fighter. It means, Marcus said softly, you picked the wrong kid. Tyler lunged first, throwing a wild haymaker that telegraphed itself from 3 feet away. Marcus slipped the punch easily, stepping inside Tyler's guard and driving an uppercut into his solar plexus that folded him in half. As Tyler gasped for air, Marcus grabbed the back of his head and drove a knee into his face, the impact making a wet, crunching sound that echoed across the empty parking lot. Tyler dropped to the pavement, blood streaming from his nose, and didn't get back up. Jake and Danny rushed him simultaneously, but Marcus had been expecting the coordinated attack. He sidestepped Jake's charge, grabbed his extended arm, and used his momentum to throw him face first into the side of a parked car. Jake hit the metal with a sound like a gunshot and slumped to the ground, groaning and clutching his head. Danny was more cautious, circling with his hands up in a basic boxing stance that suggested some real training. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, looking at Tyler's motionless form with shock and growing fear. Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he moved forward with fluid precision, feinting high before driving a devastating body shot into Danny's ribs. The bigger boy doubled over, and Marcus followed up with a left hook that snapped his head sideways and sent him spinning into the school's brick wall. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Marcus stood in the middle of the sidewalk, barely breathing hard, looking down at 3 bullies who had learned the difference between intimidating victims and fighting someone who knew how to fight back. Tyler was semi-conscious, mumbling incoherently through his broken nose. Jake was still pressed against the car, afraid to move in case he had a concussion. Danny had slid down the wall and was sitting on the ground, spitting blood and holding his ribs. "Listen carefully," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the parking lot. "This ends now. You don't talk to me, you don't look at me, and you sure as hell don't touch me or my stuff ever again. If I hear about you bothering anyone else the way you bothered me, I'll find you and we'll have another conversation. Do you understand?" Danny nodded weakly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. Jake managed a pained yes from his position against the car. Tyler was still too dazed to respond coherently. Marcus picked up his backpack and walked away, leaving the three bullies in various stages of consciousness and injury on the sidewalk behind him. As he reached the corner, he could hear Danny helping Tyler to his feet and Jake groaning about needing to go to the hospital. The next morning at Westfield High, Marcus walked through the front doors wearing the same red hoodie, but everything else had changed. Students parted to let him pass, some with obvious respect, others with nervous glances that suggested word of the parking lot confrontation had spread quickly through the school's gossip network. Tyler's crew was nowhere to be seen during first period, and by lunchtime, rumors were circulating that they'd all called in sick. Marcus ate his sandwich at his usual corner table, but this time no one bothered him. In fact, several students made a point of nodding respectfully as they passed, including Sarah Martinez, who stopped to tell him she was glad he'd finally stood up for himself. When Tyler, Jake, and Danny finally returned to school 3 days later, they were markedly different. Tyler's nose was heavily bandaged, Jake had a spectacular black eye, and Danny moved carefully as if his ribs were still bothering him. They made no attempt to re-establish their previous dominance, instead giving Marcus a wide berth and avoiding eye contact whenever their paths crossed. The transformation in Marcus was just as dramatic, but in a different way. He still wore his red hoodie and kept mostly to himself, but he carried himself with quiet confidence that commanded respect without demanding it. He'd learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to meet them on their own terms, but he'd also made sure not to become what he'd fought against. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the parking lot incident, Marcus was approached by a younger student who was clearly being picked on by some older kids. The boy was nervous, stammering as he asked if Marcus might be willing to help him deal with some bullies who were making his life miserable. Marcus listened to the story, recognized the familiar pattern of systematic intimidation, and agreed to have a conversation with the bullies in question. The conversation was brief and educational, and the younger student's problems disappeared immediately. Word spread quickly that Marcus Rodriguez was someone who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. He never sought out confrontations, never used his skills to intimidate or threaten, but everyone at Westfield High understood that he was not someone to be messed with. By the time graduation arrived, Marcus had earned something he'd never experienced at any of his previous schools: genuine respect from his peers and a reputation as someone who protected others rather than preying on them. He'd learned that strength without compassion was just another form of bullying, but that sometimes the only language bullies understood was force. The quiet kid in the red shirt had taught Westfield High an important lesson about the danger of assumptions, and 3 former bullies had learned that picking on the wrong person could have consequences they never anticipated. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.